All right, this is lecture 19C. So I've been talking about the age of discovery, and I should just mention in passing, you should put quotes around discovery. It is the age of discovery because Europeans discovered new trade routes that nobody had ever discovered before. But when you start talking about discovering America, that's obviously false because Europeans didn't discover America. The Americas had already been discovered by the Aztecs and Incas and all the other Native Americans living there. And even Christopher Columbus wasn't the first European to discover America because Leif Erikson had done it, quite a bit before him. But the age of discovery is, they're discovering the passages, the ways to connect the world. So there is discovery there, honest to God discovery, but don't, put quotes around it when you say they're discovering the Americas. So how did the Europeans discover the Americas? So in the Mediterranean, you have this power struggle going on in the mid-1400s between the Ottoman Empire, which is conquering a whole lot of the coastline of the Mediterranean. They conquer most of North Africa and the Middle East, and then they conquer, up into Greece and southeastern Europe. But then you also have these Italian states, Venice and Genoa, and then you have the Spanish who are getting involved. And all of them are basically naval powers, and they're trying to control trade and dominate, and they're trying to conquer port cities from each other so they can control trade and things like that. Well, as I mentioned, the Portuguese had decided to go around this by trying to go down the coast of Africa. And everybody began to notice by the late 1400s that the Portuguese were making a lot of money off of the sub-Saharan African trade in the Atlantic. And so the Spanish are sort of going, well, geez, can we get in on this, right? Because the Spanish are a major naval power because they've been contesting the Mediterranean for quite a while now. And so when the Portuguese, Vasco da Gama, I'm getting ahead of myself, but when the Portuguese start getting down to sub-Saharan Africa, even as early as the 1440s, they start to bring back all this trade goods from Africa, and the Spanish notice. Well, in 1492, the Italian adventurer Cristobal Colombo, or Christopher Columbus, convinces Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain that there might be money to be made by not following the Portuguese down the coast of Africa. And that was a tricky thing to do because the Portuguese had by the 1490s had established themselves along the coast of Africa. They had fortresses, they had lots of shipping there, and so it was considered a little dicey to try to push the Portuguese out of there. But Cristobal Colombo comes to Ferdinand and Isabella and says, hey, you know what, I think the world is round. And I want to just point something out. People did not think the world was flat, okay? As far back as the ancient Greeks had not only figured out that the world was round, they had actually calculated how big around the world was with some accuracy. And there's a number of ways you can do that. One is just simply watch an eclipse, where you can see the shadow of the Earth pass across the moon, and it's circular, right? But another way is that you could actually, if you notice that at high noon, a place, if you take a stick and you drive it straight into the ground at high noon at the equator, it has no shadow. But if you drive the same stick straight into the ground 200 miles north at high noon, it has a shadow. So and Europeans had used those shadows to figure out the angles, to figure out not exactly, but roughly how big the Earth was. So that people knew it was round, all right? That was not a question. But they didn't know how big around it was exactly. And there were a bunch of different theories about it. And Cristobal Colombo had a theory that the world was pretty small. And so he said to Ferdinand and Isabella, well, Asia is east of us, but it's also west of us. If we just sail around the other way, we can get to China or India, and we'll make a lot of money. And we think we've got the shipping technology to do it now. And so they agree to fund him. And in 1492, he sails the Ocean Blue, etc. He takes 2 caravels and a carrack, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and he sails across the Atlantic. And I want to just say this was quite the thing. There was a number of years ago, there was a ship came to Ashland, and it was a replica of, I forget which, the Nina or the Pinta, one of the caravels. And this thing moored up down at the marina, and you could take a tour of it. And this thing was tiny. It was 60 feet long, right? And it had like 100 sailors on it. But, you know, it was like 25 feet across and 60 feet long. And this thing was tiny, right? It was small. But it was a full-sized replica of the Nina, the Pinta, the Nina or the Pinta, I forget which. And that's what Columbus took. It took him about 3 months to sail across the Atlantic. And he then encounters, of course, he encounters the Bahamas first, but then he discovers Hispaniola and Cuba. And he essentially tries to, here again, I want to point out something. The Spanish could have gone there and just said, we're going to trade with the people we encounter. And Columbus did think he was in India at first, so he named the people Indians, etc. A lot of people very quickly realized that they were not they had not made it to Asia, that they had discovered something new. But basically, the Spanish could have just said, we're going to trade with people. And if they had made contact with the Aztecs, they could have traded with them. But instead, Columbus said, oh, I'm going to convert these people to Christianity, but I'm also going to force them to give up lots of gold and etc. And so he basically turned it into plundering and conquest, and then tried to enslave much of the population of several Caribbean islands. And he wound up actually getting sent back to Spain in chains because other Spaniards were so horrified with what he was doing. So Columbus himself was a bit of a monster. But this establishes a connection between Spain and the New World. And of course, as I sort of alluded to in the last lecture discussion, but this is really a subject for History 112, the Spanish would very quickly conquer the Aztec Empire and then the Inca Empire. And then they would dominate what we call Latin America and turn that into a colony. But by when Columbus comes back, 1490, when he comes back, the Spanish immediately start to talk to the Portuguese, and they basically, and the church is involved here also, and they convince the church that all this exploration that the Portuguese and the Spanish are doing is going to help them convert people to Christianity, and so the Pope is on board with the Spanish and the Portuguese colonizing, and the Portuguese really want to protect their trade routes to down the coast of Africa. They haven't made it around, we're talking 1494 here, they haven't made it around Africa to India yet, but they think they can. And so they want to protect that. And so they say to the Spanish, well, what is it going to take for you to agree not to horn in on our trade routes? Well, the Spanish now, they recognize they've got something in the Americas. They don't know what yet. They really don't know how big it is. They don't know who's there. They don't know how much wealth there is. And a lot of people still think they've discovered the Indies. So the Spanish are like, well, we want to protect that, right? And we want to keep the Portuguese out of that. And so they come together at the Treaty of Tordesillas, and essentially what they agree to is with the blessing of the Pope, they agree to split the world in half. That Portugal gets to trade and control trade with the Eastern Hemisphere, Africa, and then into Asia, and Spain gets to control and trade with the Western Hemisphere, whatever that is, right? And just to sort of draw a line, they say, okay, well, let's go to the Cape Verde Islands, which are off the coast of Africa. We'll go 370 miles west of that, and we'll just draw a vertical line from the North Pole to the South Pole, 370 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands, and boom, that's the line. The Portuguese get everything east of that. The Spanish get everything west of that. Well, what's kind of interesting is that this actually has one strange, unforeseen result, which is there's a Portuguese ship captain, Pedro Alvares de Cabral, who he soon after this, he's sailing down the coast of Africa. He's going to go all the way around to India. He's following Vasco da Gama. And as I talked about last time, the way you do that, I mean, the ocean currents in the southern Atlantic, south of the equator, go counterclockwise. And so what you do is you sail south until you get to the south of the equator, and then you turn west, and you sort of ride this carousel of wind currents around, and it drops you out. You go pretty far west, almost across the Atlantic, and then you come back around to the east, and it drops you down at the southern tip of Africa. Well, Cabral is doing this, but he goes too far west, and he bumps into Brazil, rather. And at first he's like, oh my gosh, I'm in Spanish territory, I'm not supposed to be here. But then he starts doing calculations, and he realizes that in fact this part of Brazil that he's run into is actually on the east side of the line that was drawn by the Treaty of Tordesillas. This line 370 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. He realizes that the eastern tip of Brazil is over that line. And so Portugal gets to claim this. And so Portugal actually would claim Brazil. Now they would actually take way more of it than they're supposed to, but that's why they speak Portuguese in Brazil today and Spanish everywhere else, is because the Portuguese grabbed Brazil because when they drew the Treaty of Tordesillas line, they didn't know that line was going to cut through South America. They didn't know South America was there. But it's in the treaty. So the Portuguese took their chunk, which turns out to be Brazil, and the Spanish took their chunk, which turns out to be the rest of Latin America, which speaks Spanish because of that. So the Europeans now have discovered the Americas, and they've now discovered a way to get around India, and they've discovered how to get to China. They, through the early 1500s, they would establish trade with Japan, with the Philippines, with China, with Indonesia, with India, with both coasts of Africa, west and east coast of Africa. They would establish connections. They would conquer the Aztec and Inca empires and establish trade with the Americas. And then eventually they would be sailing entirely around the world. And so what the Europeans have done here is they have created, for the first time in human history, a really unified trade network. European merchants and ships would now be trading, any part of the world except for Antarctica can trade with any other part of the world. They would discover Australia a little bit later, but any part of the world can trade with any other part of the world. And so this has huge implications. I mean, the first is just global trade, because now what's happening is that it's not just that the Europeans can make a lot of money by trading Indian spices, it's that Indian spices can now be sold on the west coast of Africa. They can be sold in the Americas. They can be sold in places they had never been sold before, right? And so these markets begin to emerge, and the Europeans would get enormous amounts of gold and silver, hundreds of tons of gold and silver from the Americas, and would use that to buy all these goods from China and India, etc. And what you see happen then is that places like China begin to realize that they can really specialize in export trade because they now have a much bigger market, right? And so places like India can really specialize in producing Indian textiles, which the rest of the world wants, right? And now they've got this way to sell it to the rest of the world, including people in the Americas, which they had never had access to before. So this actually causes something of a global economic boom as the world becomes more specialized and more intricately connected through trade. And this, one of the biggest things, of course, is this raises standards of living in Europe. I'll talk about what that means in just a minute. The second big thing, though, is the Europeans spread disease. I talked about this before with the Rudiment hypothesis, but essentially when Columbus shows up in the Americas, and then especially Hernán Cortés, the Spanish bring all these diseases from Europe, and Europe and Asia and parts of Africa are all one sort of disease pool in the sense that we saw with the Black Death, diseases spread between Europe and Africa, and North Africa and Asia really easily. And so all those places are basically disease pools. They have shared diseases, but the Americas were separate, which means that when European diseases show up in the Americas, mumps, measles, smallpox, they're deadly for Americans because they've never been exposed to this, right? Europeans and Asians and North Africans have partial immunity, which means they get sick, but they often don't die. They die in much lower numbers, lower percentages, than people who don't have partial immunity. So when these same diseases showed up in the Americas, Americans died in huge numbers. And they died in large enough numbers that they were affecting the overall demographics. And so each generation of Native Americans was smaller because so many had died in the previous generation of these diseases. And these diseases would just rip through Native American populations. Even before the Europeans got to some Native American populations, they were being decimated by disease. And the net result, as I mentioned before, was that between 1492 and about 1650, the population of the Americas dropped by about 90%. Which means if you counted the number of Native Americans when Columbus got there and you counted the number of Native Americans 150 years later, there's only 10% as many 150 years later as there were when Columbus got there. It was a huge loss of life, right? And then there were other diseases also, I should say. Once the Europeans began the slave trade with sub-Saharan Africa, they brought a whole another set of diseases, tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which set off another wave of deaths. So this was a huge impact of the Age of Discovery. But the final thing I want to talk about is that the Age of Discovery was Europeans established themselves as the key players in global trade networks. Now, they couldn't immediately dominate a place like China. China was too big and too rich to be dominated. But Europeans became the indispensable global trade network. And this allowed Europeans to begin amassing wealth. And when they conquered the Americas and the Aztec and Inca empires, they took all that gold and they took it back to Europe. And this allowed them, this is capital. This allows them to build up capital. And Europeans would use that as investments to engage in trade with China and India, et cetera, but also develop their own economies. And this sets off the sort of train of events economically that would lead to Europe developing into dramatically expanding its own economy through the Renaissance, and then developing the Industrial Revolution, and then taking off. If you just look at the technologies, China had the technologies to have invented the Industrial Revolution, but they didn't do it, right? But Europe had the technologies, they had the global trade network, and they had the money, and they put it together, and this allowed Europe. The Age of Discoveries, the Age of Exploration, set Europe on an economic path that led them to massive dominance of global trade, but then exploitation of lots of other parts of the world, and then conquest of the rest of the world, and then with the Industrial Revolution, the absolute domination of big chunks of the rest of the world. And so if you just look at, I just want to point out, this is getting into the next part of the course, or the next course, History 112. But if you just look at how Europe behaved after the Age of Discovery or Exploration, between 1500 and 1820, Europeans would conquer all of Latin America. Between 1600 and 1900, Europeans and their offshoots, Americans, would conquer all of North America. Right. Between 1850 and 1920, Europeans would conquer virtually all of Africa. Between 1780 and 1845, Europeans would conquer all of India. And between 1850 and 1920, they would conquer much of Southeast and South Asia. They would never conquer China, but they would dominate China economically. And after World War I, they would conquer and dominate the Middle East. And so if you count up the number of places in the world that Europeans conquered, it's well over 75% of the landmass of the world. Right? Basically, you have China and Thailand and a couple of other small places that were never conquered by Europeans, Japan. But they conquered so much else, North and South America, Africa, the Middle East, India. It's amazing, and a big part of this was this huge advantage that Europeans had from being the global trade middlemen and accruing all that wealth from that, which allowed them to develop their economies, which gave them more advantages, which allowed them to take more as colonies, et cetera, which gave them more advantages. It became a self-reinforcing process, that the more powerful they became, the more powerful they became. And so the Age of Discovery really sets this stage for a totally new era of human history. and that's why essentially we break this course at, at 1500, is that before that, the world was broken up into different spheres. They talked to each other, but they were different spheres. India was its own civilization. China was its own civilization. The Middle East was its own civilization. Sub-Saharan Africa was a separate civilization. And they were different zones, and they communicated. But after 1500, what you see happen is that these civilizations essentially begin to become integrated. And Europe is so key to that integration that Europe starts to dominate history. And so the 500 years from 1500 to 2000, Europe is really one of the dominant powers in history. And Europe is sort of, what Europe does is often driving so many aspects of history. And even the countries that, there are lots of ways in which history is not about Europe in that time period. But even the places that aren't conquered by Europe, like China, are having to respond to Europe. Now they're doing it in terms of their own culture, and that's fascinating. That's good history on its own to study how China responded. But from this point onward, Europe is really going to be a major player. And I think we're right now emerging into a new world as in our lifetimes, where Europe and the United States will fade as dominant players, and we will see China become a more dominant player. We'll probably see India become a more dominant player, and we'll see a multipoled world. But from 1500 to about 2000, Europe and then the United States, which is an offshoot of Europe, would really dominate the globe, and a big part of that is what got set up in the Age of Discovery.